back a year ago.
Welcome, everyone, to another episode of the Beer Bound podcast. Today, we are joined by two guests, Robert DeSalle and Ian Tattersall. Dr. Robert DeSalle received his bachelor's degree from the University of Chicago and his PhD at Washington University. He is a curator in the Institute for Comparative Genomics, where he leads a group of researchers working on molecular systematics, molecular evolution, population and conservation genetics, and evolutionary genomics of a wide array of life forms, ranging from viruses, bacteria, corals, and plants to all kinds of insects, reptiles, and mammals. Dr. DeSalle has worked closely with colleagues from Cold Spring Harbor Labs, New York University, and the New York Botanical Garden on seed plant genomics, and developed tools to establish gene family membership on a genome-wide scale. Oh boy, this is far above my expertise, to say the least. Dr. Ian Tattersall is a paleoanthropologist and an emeritus curator with the American Museum of Natural History in New York City. Currently, his major research focus is on how modern humans acquired a unique style of thinking and how we managed to dominate the planet while other human species went extinct. Dr. Tattersall and Dr. DeSalle put their joint expertise together to create the book, A Natural History of Beer. The text pursues the historical record and traverses the globe for engaging and often surprising stories about beer. The two authors explain how we came to drink beer, what ingredients combined to give beer their distinctive flavors, and how beer's chemistry works at the molecular level, and how various societies have regulated the production and consumption of beer. We're excited to speak with both Rob and Ian and learn more about their academic focus and expertise. Gentlemen, welcome to the Beer Bound podcast. How are you both?
Very good.
Maybe Ian, we could start with you. We gave a little bit of information about your background, but I believe we've barely scratched the surface. Can you talk just a little bit more about your connection with beer, how that dates back, and a little bit more of your academic focus?
Boy, it's hard to know where to start with that one, but by and large, Rob and I have worked together for many years on various museum projects, including curating halls, exhibition halls, and what have you. And we actually imbibed quite a lot of beer in the process of doing all this. And in the end, it became obvious that beer is actually not just a standalone kind of a subject to be talking about, but in fact, beer is a lens through which to view all of science. So virtually every kind of science converges in one way or another when you're thinking about beer, from the alcohol that it contains that is distributed throughout the universe, all the way down to the natural history of all the various ingredients it contains and all the physiological effects that it has on the body. So beer is really impinges enormously on a whole variety of areas of human experience. And we first of all did a book on wine, but it was very clear that Rob's interest is principally in beer. Rob is a brewer from way back. He's very, very wrapped up in beer and its history and its making. And it was inevitable that we should do a book on beer.
Ian, you are a paleoanthropologist. What is a paleoanthropologist?
An old anthropologist. Well, see. But no, paleoanthropologists can actually be young. Paleoanthropologists are people who study the evolution of humans, basically a story of how a fairly routine ape in the Miocene back 10 million years ago became somehow transformed over time into the rather unusual creature that humans are today. And I don't want to overstate how special human beings are in the larger scheme of things, because humans share most of their characteristics in common with all the rest of the world. But there is something about us that makes us different. And my particular interest is in studying that difference and how we acquired it.
And Rob, can you tell us about a little bit more about your background, as well as maybe how you got connected with Ian and how your academic pathways emerged?
I'm a geneticist, so I study the genes and genomes of things, and Ian and I were put together to work on a Hall of Human Origins, and genetics is part of that, as is the paleoanthropology, and we got along really well. I mean, just famously, and I hadn't known Ian that well before we did that, and the one thing that brought us together were our sessions working on this hall in the presence of a lot of drinking. we seemed to do our best thinking while we were having a glass of wine or while we were having a glass of beer. And I was just going to add to what Ian said about the seeing things through the lens of beer, seeing natural history through the lens of beer. It always looks better through the lens of beer, and our conversations always seemed really, really important through that lens of beer. And we had some really great conversations, and have collaborated on tons of things. But this beer thing was really a wonderful one, as was the wine one, because it allowed us to do some research on beer, i.e., drink a lot of beer and pontificate about it, and to think about natural history, which is what our careers are all about, in the context of beer. And that was just a lot of fun to do, and I hope that fun comes through in the book that we wrote for this.
Rob, is it normal for folks in the genetics side of academia to partner up with folks in anthropology or paleoanthropology? Is that typically a normal dichotomy that emerges, or no? Yeah, that's what I'm kind of getting at.
It's not that normal at all. In fact, a lot of the molecular biology, what molecular molecules say about the evolution of certain things, and the paleobiology clash. And fortunately, when Ian and I started to think about this stuff, our views on humans and human evolution jibed together. And I think beer had a lot to do with that. I think understanding the beer in the context of culture, beer in the context of how humans think, and what beer and alcoholic beverages, how beer and alcoholic beverages have kind of molded our cultures and molded what we are as humans, kind of brought us together in thinking about human evolution and about the way that humans react to their surroundings, and the way that humans have developed things like beer and wine and spirits and things like that to cope with the world that they live in. And I think that's what kind of brought us together. It's a not too normal thing. However, it's becoming more and more normal that molecular biologists are interacting with paleoanthropologists. And there's one reason for that, and that is that we can get DNA from fossils now. That wasn't common 10, 15 years ago. But researchers have now developed technology that's just spectacular that allows us to sequence fossils. In fact, this year's Nobel Prize winner, Svante Pääbo, won the Nobel Prize exactly for that, for sequencing the Neanderthal genome. So we're seeing more and more of it. But in general, no, it's not a very common thing.
Unique collaboration.
Yeah, well, I think the two kind of go hand in hand more, and I think you both did a really amazing job with your text. But you hinted at this. It wasn't beer that started this partnership in the first book that you two co-authored, because I think it was your initial focus was wine, correct?
That's correct. Yeah, and I don't really like wine myself, but Ian was trying to teach me not only what wine was and all the different varieties of wine, but he was trying to teach me how to drink wine, which, if you're a beer drinker, switching to drinking wine is pretty difficult because you tend to gulp in more with beer.
He was very tolerant about having to drink all that wine. I didn't really find out for a while that he really would much rather be drinking beer. But as soon as I did, I was very happy to switch. I've been drinking beer probably longer than I've been drinking wine. So it was very, very easy for me to get into line and particularly get with the idea of this book.
Mm-hmm.
I was a very willing student, actually, and we teach a wine course every year in Italy now as a result of it. And once as a geneticist, once I learned about the variety of grapes that are out there, and this strange thing called terroir, I was just enthralled by it and really drawn to trying to understand wine as a biological phenomenon. And Ian would always bring me back and say, no, you're supposed to be tasting the wine, and you're supposed to be appreciating it from that perspective. And we're both science nerds, so we both levitate toward trying to understand it in a biological natural history context.
I feel like that goes a long way, though. I feel like, just maybe not to the extent that perhaps you guys did, but like Andy and I always try and get into, like, the whys and the hows behind beer to really tell the full picture, right? Because obviously, hey, here's a beer, here's a style, drink it, this is what you should taste. But like, why, how, what went into it, what ingredients, where those ingredients come from. So I think we could definitely relate, and there is something to be said about, let's say, diving a little deeper.
Well, definitely.
Yeah,
that's one of the really cool things about for me about doing this book was that that Rob had me brew a few batches of beer with him.
Oh, excellent!
Interesting beers. I mean, we brew it because we couldn't find it anywhere else to taste an unhopped beer. You can't find an unhopped beer, right? And so it's
difficult to find.
Yeah. So that was something.
We had a lot of fun.
It was fun.
Did you do 0 hops, or did you add something else?
0,
like a gruit? Oh, okay.
0. Mostly herbal kind of a hopping, but nothing. We also brewed a really cool bourbon barrel aged ale that was really great. So it was really, we had a lot of fun doing this.
Of course, that sounds great. Those sound good. Bourbon barrel aged, yeah. Anything bourbon barrel aged, you really can't go wrong. The barrel does some really good stuff.
That was fun.
Well, Ian, maybe can you take us back in time and divulge a little bit of context into our species and its connection to beer? We've spoken to a few academics and are really interested in finding exactly when human beings first started to create and to imbibe in beer.
Well, I'll give you some information. I'm not sure if I can give you an answer, because the very first brewed beverage that we know of, that, alcoholic beverage that is documented from the residues of the chemicals in it left behind on the inside of the jars in which it had been brewed, is neither a beer, nor a wine, nor a mead, but kind of a mixture of all of them. It comes from China, a place called Jiangsu. It's about 9,000 years old. So 9,000 years is a long time. It's right at the beginning of this period, the Neolithic, where people were settling down and going into agriculture for the very first time. Prior to that, virtually, people had been hunters and gatherers from the beginning. They wandered around the landscape and they availed themselves of whatever was available. And then at the end of the last ice age, after about 12,000, 11,000, 10,000 years ago, people in various parts of the world started to settle down and raise crops. And this beverage, which our colleague Pat McGovern, who analyzed is an expert on analyzing early alcoholic beverage residues. He calls it a grog. It has hawthorn flowers in it. So it's got fruit. It's got hawthorn fruit rather. It has fruit from hawthorn, but it's fruited like a wine. It has honey in it. Had honey in it, like a mead, and it had cereal in it. It had rice in it, like a beer. And so this earliest 9,000-year-old alcoholic beverage, which might have come in at a very respectable 8 or 9% alcohol, actually has the characteristics of all three. And then those three different traditions, the mead making tradition, the beer making tradition, the wine making tradition, later on went off in their own directions and have their own histories. But at the very beginning, they converge. And to me, that's a very interesting thing, because it suggests that as soon as people figured out how they could ferment beverages to produce alcohol in any quantities, they were fermenting everything in sight. They were experimented with whatever it was organic that could be fermented. And it just happens to be that this 9,000-year-old beverage has a bit of the elements of everything in it. So it was the first beer, but it was also the first wine. It was also the first mead.
And you called it, so you said grog? Was it called grog, you said? Is that what you mentioned?
Yeah, Pat McGovern would call it grog.
Okay, interesting.
Just as a sort of generic term for a fermented beverage of unspecific origin.
I was going to point out that wine does have some really good research on where its origin comes from, and Ian can correct me because he probably knows more about this. But wine seems to have come from Areni, a site in Armenia, and it appears to be the oldest winery on the planet. Beer, on the other hand, is much more difficult to pin down as to where the first, say, European or Western kind of beverage was produced. But it appears that wine, and this is also Pat McGovern's work and his colleagues, wine has a really pretty well-known starting point, or at least it's very, very early origins.
That's right. Now we have a good record for wine, and of course you don't need to tread a beer, right? You need to tread a wine, so you need a treading platform, and that's something that you can easily pick up in the archaeological record, because it's something that's going to preserve. Where you make beer, not necessarily do you have the same recognizable things, but it's true that we don't have a record of beer in the same way that we have a record of wine. And we have wine residues in Georgia, in the Caucasus, back to about 8,000 years ago. The winery that Rob was just talking about is about 6,000 years old. We don't have any specific beer evidence quite that old, but we do know that by about 5,000 years ago, beer was being made in Europe, and in some quite northern parts of Europe too, in Skara Brae in Scotland, about 5,000, much as 5,200 years ago. You have evidence, good evidence, that beer was being brewed. So that's a pretty good antiquity that we already have brewing beer. But I think what must have happened is that people started brewing or started fermenting beverages using everything that they could find, and then in different parts of the world, depending on what was available, you have the traditions went in different ways. And beer tended to be brewed in northern climates where cereals would grow but grapes wouldn't. Right. And you go further south where you're growing grapes, you have less of a beer tradition and more of a wine tradition.
Right.
And then there's the obvious connection between beer and bread too.
Right.
A lot of people just consider beer as liquid bread or vice versa, and it's difficult to pin down where bread was first made, where the grains were first used to produce foodstuffs. So that notion that we have a pretty good handle on wine's antiquity is right. But then we get a lot of information 3 or 4,000 years ago of the existence of beer. We have the Assyrian Sumerian song of Ninkasi, and we have all these other ancient evidences of the existence of beer. So we have a pretty good, more recent history of beer. But again, that ancient history of wine the ancient history of beer is a little bit difficult to pin down.
A little fuzzier.
Although it is true that if you're going to associate beer and bread, then bread, I believe, bread, there is bread known from the Ice Age, like 14,000-year-old bread is actually known. But a accidentally preserved piece of bread, something was incinerated in a fire that could preserve in sediments rather than rot away, is something you might expect to find. Beer is liquid. It runs out of the container, it evaporates, it's gone. And if you don't find residues of it that are preserved within an ancient container, you're just not going to find any evidence of beer. So the existence of beer at a very early age is going to be more inferential than something like wine that needs to be trodden and prepared with a more elaborate kind of physical apparatus.
I don't blame early consumers of beer for not wasting any. So
Who would?
Yeah. Do we know? I know we have some evidence towards the script, some poetry from the Sumerians and some texts from the Mesopotamians that show that beer was produced and consumed maybe 4,000 or 5,000 years ago. Do we know? I mean, our species goes back many, many more. I think what would constitute a Homo sapien today probably goes back 100,000 years. Am I totally off with that? But I think that's about
right. I mean, some people look like us, physically like us, go back 200,000 years or more, but who behaved like us probably only goes back about 100,000 years. You don't get the production of things like beer and other fermented beverages until much later on. And but as soon as people settled down and started cultivating crops and what have you, that's when it all seemed to have started. Now, Pat McGovern would say, well, it probably went back much, much longer than that. The people have been able to get hold of fruit, and fruit has been naturally fermenting, and honey has been around for a very, very long time. The problem is that you don't have the material evidence back that far, because pottery wasn't made, until sometime after people actually had settled down. And pottery is where we're finding the residues of ancient fermented beverages. Without the pottery, there's nothing to find the evidence in. You may be able to brew beer in a goat's bladder or something like that, but that evidence is just not going to preserve. So that's what we're running into the whole time. But Pat would tell you absolutely that it is sort of hardwired or soft-wired anyway into people to want to create and drink alcoholic beverages, and they were doing it back as far as it was possible for them to come up with some way of doing it. But you're not going to have the evidence back beyond basically the invention of pottery, which takes us back to about 8,000 years ago in Europe.
And part of this story too is that Homo sapiens is pre-adapted to drinking alcoholic beverages. Our genomes have genes in them that process alcohol that we intake, and a lot of other organisms, even some of our close primate organisms, cannot process alcohol. at the rate that we can process it. So we were, in a sense, pre-adapted to drinking alcohol. I think the genetic changes that occurred that made us pre-adapted are common to chimpanzees also, and that means that chimpanzees are pre-adapted to drinking alcohol too. And there's a lot of good evidence that chimpanzees imbibe in alcohol. Ian knows a lot more about that than I do, but the point I'm trying to make is that with this predilection we have for drinking alcoholic beverages is partly due to the fact that we can process it to a certain extent. Alcohol is not good for you at all, as any doctor will tell you, or as any chemist will tell you. But we have this capacity to imbibe some of it, and that capacity to imbibe balances against the bad things that can happen physiologically, and that's part of the story too.
Yeah, that's right, because alcohol is a toxin, basically. And as I understand it, the idea, Robin, correct me if I'm wrong, is that yeast first started producing alcohol as a way of fending off competition from other microorganisms in the environment. They produced this stuff and became very successful because they were producing a toxin that nothing else could deal with.
Yeah.
And basically, most organisms can deal with it. And there was a study done about 4 or 5 years, well, no, add COVID, maybe 8 years ago now, in which it was found that humans have a very unusual form of the enzyme that breaks down the alcohol that we imbibe. And if we didn't have that form of the enzyme, we just couldn't deal with it. But it was acquired about 10 million years ago, which is before the African great apes, and humans went their own separate ways. So African great apes, gorillas, and chimpanzees have this enzyme, and everything else basically in the primates doesn't. So we are the only primate and one of the few mammals that can actually deal with alcohol.
And with respect to this toxicity, any good brewer or winemaker knows that the limit of alcoholic content is about 14-15%, maybe a little bit higher. And that's where alcohol becomes toxic to the yeast. And that's where that's why the limit of, say, wines are up at a certain point, and the limit of beers are at a certain point too. So that toxicity is not only affects us and affects other organisms, it affects the organism that actually makes the alcohol that we have in alcoholic beverages.
And Rob, what does it do to the yeast? So if you're at a much higher alcoholic quantity, it just kills it. So if you're talking like a whiskey or a vodka, the yeast is dead.
Yeah, it gets to the point where the yeast can no longer fission so that they can reproduce, and in fact, it's so toxic that it starts to kill the yeast, and it's kind of a suicidal cycle. The yeast are making more and more alcohol, and it gets to a point where the alcohol starts to kill them off, and the organisms like that can't shut it off. They just keep going, and that's why you have that ceiling that you just can't get over.
Yeah, so the brewers and your winemakers and whatnot are putting the yeast in a very unfortunate predicament, because the yeast just normally they're out there in the environment and they're producing this this alcohol, and then it blows off and evaporates and disappears in the natural environment. But if they're in a vat, the story is very different. It accumulates, and in the end, it accumulates in enough quantities to kill the organism that makes it off. And yet, at those concentrations, human beings can still deal with it. And that's pretty impressive.
You mentioned that chimpanzees are obviously one of our close relatives, imbibe in alcohol as well. Is that typical? I'm not too familiar. Would it just be through rotting fruit that they find in their natural environment? How does a chimpanzee come across alcohol?
Well, the thing is that chimpanzees and humans, or the common ancestor before chimpanzees and humans went their own way, acquired this this ability to deal with alcohol in an unknown context. We don't know why. Maybe just something that happened. It was a mutation that occurred. It just didn't get in the way. It was conserved in the organisms and just carried along until at some point it became useful. But there is a famous study of chimpanzees in West Africa at a place called Bossou, where you have forest that is adjacent to a raffia palm plantation. The raffia plantation had workers who got thirsty, and they used to collect the sap from the raffia palm trees in containers. Now, I don't know if you've ever tried palm toddy, but you probably heard of it at least, right?
Actually, no. It's probably the first time I've heard of it.
Okay, well, this is the sap of the palm, and if you collect that sap in a container, at first it's very sweet tasting. It's actually quite seductive in taste, but it rapidly starts fermenting, and as it ferments, it becomes more and more and more pungent, and eventually it becomes just repellent. I can't tell you how repellent it is. And but by the time it gets to 3 or 4 or 5, even 5% alcohol, it's really rather undrinkable by my standards. But anyway, the people who were studying the chimpanzees noticed that once in a while the chimpanzees would come out of the forest and go into the palm, the raffia palm plantation, where the workers were collecting the sap of the palm in these in plastic buckets, and they saw the chimpanzees go in there, and they couldn't get their hands into these little containers. But what they could do, they couldn't get their faces in there. But what they could do is would be to chew up some leaves, and then take a bunch of leaves and dip them in the palm sap and bring them to the mouth, and they would be doing this and this and this and this, obviously enjoying it immensely. And they would go and do this quite regularly when the plantation workers were distracted. They'd whip out of the forest, go down in the plantation, and buy stuff, and they were loving it. And at the end of it, you know, they didn't have any evidence or any physiological measurements to make about whether the chimpanzees were getting drunk or not, but they concluded that there was quite a buzz, actually, that the chimpanzees were getting out of it. So the chimpanzees were voluntarily drinking this really horrible stuff, you know, what I think is horrible stuff, and presumably for the buzz that they got from the alcohol.
Interesting.
Yeah. And then there was another study made to follow up, but it was really a bit of a bust, because probably because the regulations about the treatment of chimpanzees mean you can't get them drunk. Some researchers went to a zoo, and they fed or they offered a rum flavored rum substitute to chimpanzees, who were kind of interested at first, but then lost interest in it. And I think that they lost interest in it basically because there wasn't any alcohol in it.
Wasn't getting the job done.
So if other mammals, like particularly like chimpanzees or human beings, we have a particular enzyme that handles alcohol in one particular way, and it causes us to experience the certain after effects that alcohol gives to us. But if you give alcohol to different mammals or to different species, is it suffice to say that there would be different effects? It wouldn't be exactly the same, the outcomes, the side effects of alcohol, or would they be similar?
Well, there was there was a case of somebody who gave eggnog to a hedgehog, and the hedgehog expired before it was drunk enough to be legally unable to drive
Oh
in New York
no.
State. So yeah, I mean, alcohol can be really, really toxic and damaging to other organisms who are unable to detoxify in the way in which we can.
Hmm.
But there are other organisms that can deal with it too. There's another primate called the ii in Madagascar, which is a very strange form of lemur that seems to have the same enzyme that we do, the same genetic variant that we do, which just simply shows that if you're a primate, it's not that hard to get that by normal evolutionary mechanisms. So it's nothing really out of the way. But there is a famous little creature, 2 ounces, I think, a pintail tree shrew, weighs a couple of ounces. And these guys live in Malaysia, and they've been seen binging on the fermenting sap of the Bertam palm. It's a different kind of palm they have over there. Produces a lot of nectar, and the nectar ferments very rapidly. And you've seen these tiny animals just binging on this stuff for hours and hours and hours on end, and nobody knows how it deals with it. Its close relative, the regular tree shrew, was in the study that showed that humans had this very remarkable form of the enzyme, and they didn't have it. Okay, so the closest relative, the pintail tree shrew, does not have the same enzyme that we do, but it seems to be able. But its close relative, the pintail tree shrew, seems to be able to deal with it, and maybe dealing with it by another mechanism. We don't know. The study hasn't been done yet.
Yeah, I've seen this tree shrew. It just gets drunk all the time, but it probably isn't. It probably is. It isn't drunk like we are, but it consumes alcohol constantly.
Oh, it's drunk.
This is a tiny animal in an environment that's full of rapacious predators. Everybody wants to eat tree shrews, right? And a tree shrew can't afford to let its guard slip for a moment. You know, we go to the pub and we can get pleasantly lit and stagger out and not have to worry too much about it. But a pintail tree shrew, man, doesn't have that luxury. It can't let its guard slip for a minute. If anything appears in the environment around it that might be a hazard to it, it has to react very quickly.
Maybe the consumption of that alcohol puts it in, I don't know, maybe a state of, I don't know, improved concentration, makes it even more aware. Who knows?
Well, I have absolutely no idea, but strange things happen. There's a lemur in Madagascar that every day eats enough cyanide to kill 2 people, 2 grown. And it's only, it's this big. It weighs what, 2-3 pounds. Nobody knows how that's done either. There are all kinds of strange things that happen in nature that we don't know about.
That's for sure.
Well, Rob, you dedicate a part of the entire book to your field of expertise. You kind of delve into the 4 major ingredients that go into a standard beer that we know today, and you sort of give the molecular breakdown and kind of accenting the uniqueness of a beer. Can you talk a little bit about this in terms of what makes a beer unique when you really delve into the molecules and the atoms, and what makes a beer special when you really analyze each 4 of its ingredients in its creation?
The Germans defined the purity of beer with three things: water, barley, and hops, right?
Mhm.
And they didn't. This was back in the 1600s, 1700s, the purity laws, and I may have that date wrong, but they left out yeast, right? And that's because we didn't know that yeast was a fermenter until Pasteur and others in the late 1800s. And so these ingredients have different characteristics amongst them. Barley has a certain characteristic of its contribution to beer, and hops, of course. This is a really hot area of beer making now, is hops. And I'm sure most of your listeners know about those two things. But one thing that I tried to bring out is that water has a huge impact on beer. And just as to make a point, water has really influenced our cultural concepts of beer drinking. So when you think of the Irish, what do you think of? You think of stouts, heavy stouts with lots of flavoring and lots of stuff. When you think of the Brits, you think of heavy ales. But then when you start to think about the Czechs and the Germans, you start to think about pilsners and lagers, very, very light kinds of stuff. And I think that was driven mostly by the water. Water has what's called hardness or softness, right? And the more minerals in water, the harder it's perceived to be, and the more difficult it is to cover over the impact of the minerals when you put that into a brew. Whereas a very, very soft water is indicative of a water with very few phosphates and calcium molecules in it. And so the drinking culture, the beer cultures of Germany and Czechoslovakia levitated toward these light, crisp, barely hopped kinds of beers, and perpetuated for several hundred years. And the beer culture in Ireland and Britain developed around these harder waters, because the waters in Great Britain and in Dublin, Ireland, are really, really hard waters. They're very, very highly mineralized, and so the beer brewers there had to do certain things to make their beer drinkable. Whereas the Germans and the Czechs have this really, really soft water, probably the softest water that's used in making beer. So that contribution of water to how we make beer is manifest in those 3 or 4 different kinds of beer drinking cultures, which is really kind of cool. Nowadays, brewers will adjust the hardness or the softness of the water that they use. One of the first things that a microbrewer buys is probably a device that removes the minerals from water and softens the water to a point where they can then add minerals back to adjust it to a specific hardness or softness. So that new way of being able to use water is think of water, it's just water, right? But brewers are now really, really concentrating on the hardness and softness of the water. And I think if you go back to that example that I gave you of soft water producing pilsners and lagers, and harder water producing stouts and ales, that makes a lot of sense that brewers are doing that nowadays.
I've heard that a few times actually in some of our conversations with brewers, that it's that overlooked fact. One of the 4 main ingredients, right? Water. Like you said, it's just looked at as just water, but a lot goes into it, especially now when we're sort of seeing a lot of craft brewers, at least in Southern Ontario anyways, sort of revert back to some of the traditional styles of beer, like you were saying, Czech pilsners and British bitters and things of that nature. So they're really trying to hammer down the style. You gotta hammer down what went into it when it was actually created, and a lot of that plays from the water. So
it's easy, I think, to adjust water, to deal with water, the yeast and the barley and the hops are much more difficult because they're organisms, and their traits are and their qualities are kind of dictated by their genomes. And just to suffice it to say, though, the genomes of hundreds of barley strains and the genomes of thousands of yeast strains have been sequenced now. So we have the primary information from these organisms that are involved in beer. As hops, there's tens, if not 50 to 100 hop genomes that have been sequenced. So there's lots of this genomic information coming in that may make manipulating hops, barley, and yeasts as easy as manipulating the softness and hardness of water, which would bring in a really cool new era of brewing.
And Rob, what about yeast? Can you talk to us a little bit about what's going on in yeast? You mentioned obviously yeast was kind of this magical entity in beer that we didn't really know about until Mr. Louis Pasteur and his team in 1800 in 19th century France and in Western Europe. So, and now we have sort of definitely in the micro and craft beer world an explosion in and an interest in replicating different strains of yeast. But can you talk a little bit about what goes in sort of the molecular breakdown of yeast and how complex it is in terms of the fermentation process and getting beer into being what it is?
Yeah, they're more or less they're alcohol factories, but and that's because they bring sugars in, and the sugars come into the yeast, and yeast have evolved a way of processing the sugars that where alcohol is a byproduct, and so they give off all this alcohol. Bacteria don't do that. Bacteria produce other outputs, and so yeast becomes very, very important for the alcohol content. But the fact that yeast are really, really variable is really kind of neat. Like I say, thousands of yeast genomes have been sequenced, and we now know that there are two major kinds of beer yeasts. And these beer yeasts don't make much sense. You might think that the two different kinds of beer yeasts are lagers versus ales, right? I mean, they're very different. One's a top fermenter, one's a bottom fermenter. And you might think that those two divisions are the way things go, but it's not that way. The different yeasts that are used in brewing beer have separated into very different lineages for producing alcohol in beers. And then when you compare the yeast in beer to the yeast in wine, a very interesting thing happens, and that is that yeasts in wine are really, really closely related to each other, no matter what wine you're using. And yeasts in beer are really diverse. This is a really common thing when you have domestication of an organism. When you have a domestication of an organism, the different lineages become more and more different from each other. And that's what's happened with yeast. Yeasts have been tamed and domesticated for beer, but for wine, they haven't been tamed and domesticated that much. Basically, a winemaker will allow whatever yeast are in its winemaking facility to ferment the wine. And it's changing a lot nowadays, but this little guy, this little single-celled organism, is at the heart of making alcohol, and it's a very efficient machine, and has evolved to be efficient to process sugar, but one of the side products is alcohol.
And you also, both of you touched in the text about what alcohol and beer does to our bodies. So the effects that it has on our senses, on our consciousness, on our physical health, on what it does to our, you have I think a little chapter about beer and what it does to your belly and what it does to your head. Can you guys,
it's
both
ugly.
of you, yeah,
It's ugly.
maybe it's not the most positive thing, but Rob
after
or Ian,
writing that chapter, I think Ian and I didn't drink beer for about a month. Drink any alcohol beverages for about a month. We of course corrected our focus, but we wanted to make sure that the reader understood that alcohol in your body is very toxic, and that you know, the kinds of things that can happen to your body when you put too much alcohol in your body. You know, drinking beer and drinking wine, drinking spirits is all about an art of adjusting how much you take in, and there's a fine line between enjoyment and you know, really wrecking yourself. And we wanted people to make sure that they understood that at the physiological level and at the neurological level, because the way alcohol affects your brain is even more brutal than in some ways than it affects your liver and your kidney and other physiological processes in your body.
Well, maybe what does beer do? Maybe we can focus on the brain, because that is probably the most damaging part of our body that is affected by alcohol and by beer. What exactly does beer do to our brain?
Well, the alcohol in beer, well, there's several things that it does to our brain. First is that when we taste it, it really stimulates a lot of things in our brain. When we smell it, when we look at it, the color of it, the sound of it, you know, coming out of the bottle, the pop of the bottle. All of our senses are stimulated by drinking beer. But once that alcohol gets into your body, it's absorbed into your blood system through your intestinal wall or through your stomach. Then it goes into your blood system and it goes to your brain sooner or later. And then alcohol interferes with the processes that go on in the synapses between your nerve cells. And in a lot of ways, what it does is it shuts down the communication between nerve cells, which is why you get a little groggy, a little slow, a little out of it when you drink too much alcohol. But at the same time, what's happening in your brain is that your dopamine levels, which is the pleasure molecule, are coming up, telling your body to drink more. And so alcohol has a profound effect on your nervous system, and it's kind of nasty because it you know, if you were able to stop without somebody telling you to stop, you'd stop. But your brain is telling you to drink more, and it's like any drug. It's just nasty because it's hardwired in a process that tells you to do more of it. And to seek more and more pleasure from what you were doing. And as we all know, that can be really pretty disastrous in a lot of ways.
Learn to ignore the basic instinct in a sense after you've had a drink or two.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, you could do that, or you could, you know, and just not buy that much beer. Which didn't happen to me over the pandemic.
Mm-hmm.
I'd be drinking a lot more alcohol. The beer is relatively benign from this point of view, and we can be happy for that.
Yeah.
Because you're getting a lot of gustatory quality out of beers. You're getting a lot of satisfaction in many ways to the senses. And you could be drinking something that was going to affect your brain negatively a lot more.
Yeah, I think that's why I like beer more than wine. I think the gustatory, olfactory, visual, auditory stimulation that it gives me when I drink it is much more variable than say wine. And that may be part of the reason of that may be that I'm not a very very well schooled wine drinker, but certainly the range of tastes in beer are just amazing compared to, in my mind, to the taste that you can get from wine. And I think for that reason, I think beer is much more interesting to me than wine. Now, wine's pretty cool if you know what you're tasting and you know how to taste it. But I don't think you really need to know much to experience the broad variety of things of sensory stimulation that you get from beer versus wine.
Mm-hmm.
I'm sure I'm pissing off a lot of wine drinkers, but
do both well, right? It's like if you ever smoke cigarettes, you better not try to smoke cigars. Right? And to a lesser extent, the other way around. It's a different way of experiencing the stimulus. and you must not get them confused, because the results can be really terrible. I think beer drinking is a sort of a different thing from drinking from drinking wine, and not many people can do both with equal expertise. Let's put it that way.
You are the only person I know who can do both of those beverages at the same level.
But you have, but if you do it, you notice you're doing different things.
Yes, sir.
Yeah, I would agree with that.
You never swill wine.
No,
But
never
sometimes
go.
beer can be really very rewarding.
Never swirl beer.
Swirl. What else? Yeah.
Right.
But no, there's two different experiences, even though they have alcohol in common. And but you have to remember that they are different things that need to be drunk in different ways.
Yeah, and they produce different cultural kinds of auras around them. The beer drinking culture is very, very different from the wine drinking culture, and I find that very, very interesting. And it may be part of the reason I can't shift from beer to wine. It's just hard for me to, get into that.
Like those cultures are blurring a little bit, maybe especially with craft beer, and we have beer competitions now, and it's almost seen in a lens of wine sipping and wine tasting, right? You're not where maybe the tried and true beer culture, as it were, was large quantities, big gulps, that sort of thing. Whereas I've we see that in craft beer now, maybe it's more small sips, focusing on flavor, what you're pulling from it, which is more accustomed to the wine drinking. But yeah, it's still very stark, contrast to when you look at maybe the mass beer drinkers versus the mass wine drinkers. I can see what you mean.
I think it'd be kind of cool to come back to that original beer that Ian talked about at the beginning of the podcast, and come back to a beverage that is a wine, a beer, and both a wine and a beer at the same time, and that might be a really cool way to move. When I was in Australia, I had a beer that was made from fermented wine, but then diluted so that and then carbonated so that it had a head and everything. It was a Sauvignon Blanc, and that had been treated in this way. It was just really, really nice drinking. I mean, it was really interesting drinking, and it wasn't like drinking wine because the alcohol content was only around 6-7%, and the taste was just spectacular, and it had been hopped too. So right. It was really an interesting drink, and I'd like to see more of that out there in the.
Well, you know what? I think that there is a difference between tasting and drinking. When you are drinking, you're relaxed, you're not thinking too much about it, you're just in the moment, you're in the occasion, and that's it. When you're tasting, you are concentrating on what it is that you're tasting. And I think that you're tasting beer, you're tasting wine, you're tasting whatever, you are sort of exercising the same concentration in both cases, and what you are going to be doing and what you're going to be experiencing are going to converge. I think when you're just relaxing and drinking wine and drinking beer, you're doing two completely different things. So that although yes, with I'm more than delighted at the craft beer revolution, and the craft beer revolution gives you a chance to do more of this comparative cerebral thing, comparing this with that and the other. But that's not when I'm enjoying it most.
You mean you don't? One of the things that Ian and I do and did to prepare for the book is we used flavor wheels to grade beers or to sort the beers out. And I think that's what he's talking about. I found that those sessions to be much more tense than if I was just with a mug of beer, in a bar drinking, because you really had to pay attention and really had to try to get things right. But one of the cool things about what we did with those flavor wheels is you can transform the information from the flavor wheels and then try to understand how the different beers are related to each other. And so we did that. Yeah, there's a flavor wheel
Got
right
mine
there.
handy.
Yeah, pretty cool. And what we did was we did this, and it turned out that we had two major groups of beer from our flavor wheels, but it wasn't, hoppy beers versus not. It was beers we liked and beers we didn't. So the flavor wheels really tell you what you like and what you don't like. That's an interesting thing. But we were very serious about this with the flavor wheels. And I recommend it to anybody who's drinking beer to have a couple of sessions with flavor wheels and six different beers or something like that, and you'll get a better sense for what you're tasting. It's a lot of fun.
What Rob is talking about here is not exactly the same thing you were holding, which was a more thing. It's a diagram on which you have radially you have a whole range of different sensory qualities, and then you rate the beer from say 1 to 5 along each of those qualities. And then you see what then you join up the tips on the diagram and see what kind of a circle you come up with. And what we found was that we didn't like a circle that was just jagged in one direction or in another direction, or that was smooth all around, but it was balanced. You had something that was emphasized over here and something else over there and something else over here to balance it again. Yeah. And that was very instructive. We had a lot of fun doing that, I have to say.
This goes back to the diversity that I talked about a little bit earlier. We tended to like those more diverse beers, those beers that really piqued our interest and made us draw the put a point on the beer wheel that showed that it was different from everything else. And I think that was what we were looking for. And I love that whole diversity thing. I love what Ian said a little while ago about craft beers and creating a diversity of things that allow us to really experience to get a great experience of beer. So
definitely a fun exercise, that's for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, Rob, Ian, we're coming up pretty close to our hour mark, so we want to be respectful of both of your time. But I think maybe something that we've sort of weaved in and out of the positive effects and the negative effects and the interesting facets of both the biological repercussions of beer to our species, as well as the anthropological, historical significance of beer in its connection to us, to our development, to our history, as well as our modern sense of being. I'll extend this question to both of you separately. Do you see beer and its profound connection to the human being as perhaps a necessary, beautiful love story of two entities kind of going through thousands of years together and creating positive repercussions both to our health, our mental health, and our culture? Or do you see it maybe more as a toxic relationship of it being more of a drug that we've latched onto for thousands of years, and perhaps we should do away with eventually because it causes more malevolence than benevolence?
Let me go first, because I know Ian's answer is going to be much more eloquent and descriptive than mine. I think that the point that needs to be made is it depends on who you are. Different people have different capacity for alcoholic beverages, and we would never advocate that you abuse anything that we've ever written about. We now finished a spirits book, and we not advocate to abuse any of this. It's not there to abuse. It's there to enlighten, and it's there to expand the human experience. And if you're a person who can't deal with that, then you really should not go that way. We've tried we've tried to abolish alcohol. We've tried to prohibit it, and it just doesn't work. It creates more problems, social problems, than it solves. So my major point would be that it depends on who you are, and if you're going to have a beer or two, think about what you're doing before you do it. And I know Ian has a much more eloquent answer to this than I do.
No, there's nothing that I disagree with there at all, and I think you said it very well. But alcohol, beer, whatever, it's the yin and the yang. And we've written a book about this, the fact that we're prisoners to the normal distribution of behaviors. You can't have the good without the bad in humanity. The price of having a few saints is having a few monsters. The price of having very rich people is having very poor people. Every part of human experience exists on this kind of yin and yang spectrum, and we can't expect that alcoholic drinks are going to be any different. I would hate to be part of a bland and boring world in which alcoholic drinks had no place, whatever. But I do recognize that there is a price that some individuals are paying, and I think that Rob put this very, very well, in the sense that are individuals that really cannot deal with this and should not even try. But for most of us, our lives are enhanced, and I would hate for my life not to be enhanced by the enjoyment of beer.
Yeah, I think we'd be a completely different species that last 100,000 years, and specifically the last 10,000 years, if we hadn't the capacity to imbibe alcohol. I think alcohol has molded our cultures. It's molded the way we think about the world. It's molded how we think about our consciousness. It's done all kinds of amazing things. But as Ian said, there's a yin and a yang to it.
A very eloquent answer from both of you. Gentlemen, thank you very much for your time. Robert DeSalle and Ian Tattersall, authors of A Natural History of Beer. Gentlemen, this flew by, and I feel like we barely scratched the surface of this wonderful text, as well as the wealth of knowledge that both of you have. So we really appreciate your time and hope that we can do this again in the near future.
Thanks, guys.
Very much.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
Thanks, gentlemen. Bye. Be sure to subscribe to stay up to date on all our interviews and beer-related content. Remember, craft beer is here.